Fantastic. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. It's our great pleasure to be joined tonight by Professor Julie Smith of All Souls College, Oxford, who will be speaking to us on the subject of saints, hagiography, and relics in the Middle Ages. Professor Smith is a Chichele Professor of Medieval History and has been a Fellow of All Souls since 2016 and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Her previous positions have been at Sheffield, St Andrews, Manchester, Trinity College, Hertford and Connecticut, and Glasgow. She's written and edited a number of publications from 1992 to 2012 on subjects such as Brittany and the Carolingians, early medieval Rome, gender in the early medieval world, Europe after Rome, early medieval Christianity, and relics in the medieval West. She's also published a broad variety of journal articles in English and French, covering subjects such as early medieval relics, 8th century Rome, relics in Carolingian rulers, the care of relics, Christian medieval culture, Christian material culture, as well as pilgrimage and spiritual healing. And she's currently researching for a book, or possibly two, on the cult of relics from the 4th to 11th centuries. Her research interests include late antique and early medieval history from the 5th to 11th centuries, the history of women and gender, and the cultural history of religion, with a particular emphasis on material culture of medieval religion, interdisciplinary ways of approaching relics, as well as finding new and unusual angles from which to address seemingly familiar topics. Professor Smith, it's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Ra, and thank you all for the invitation to talk to you tonight. I want to talk to you in very general terms about some of my works on saints, hagiography, and relics in the Middle Ages. I'm starting with an image which may or may not be familiar to you, which is a probably 8th century box made out of whalebone, containing a whole load of relics, all wrapped up and very neatly labelled with little parchment tags from the 9th century, which tell us what's the name of the saint that's inside each one, but nothing more than that. And I wanted to introduce a lot of what I want to talk about, which is the interplay of textual written evidence and material, physical, tangible evidence, and to ask questions about how saints' cults function, how they're represented in the Middle Ages, and in particular to talk about relics. And what I really want to do to stress at the outset to you all is that it's a subject which has too often been studied with a strong teleological slant, with modern definitions of what a cult is, of what relics are, of how to categorize them, and of how a saint's cult should work. And I want to just set all of that sort of stuff aside and take you through some empirical evidence and to really make two points really very strongly to you through the use of quite a lot of visual images. The first is that saints' cults, hagiography, relics are all very dynamic. Each cult changes over time. The overall shape and nature of saints' cults changes a lot. And after all, if we're talking about the Middle Ages, we're talking about the best part of 1,000 years. The other thing I want to say is that any individual cult will go through phases of more or less activity. I've used the metaphor before, or the simile before, of saints' cults being a bit like volcanoes, that they're quiescent and then they suddenly erupt into action. So they're dynamic, they change, they're quite often unpredictable. That's the first general point I want to make. But the second equally important point I want to make is that there is no paradigmatic example. They're all different. They're all huge variations on a template which is about specifically Christian belief, about the way that dead people are intermediaries between people here and now and whatever there is there in the great hereafter and the great beyond. So there's no paradigmatic, no single model. There's a huge spectrum of activities, and I think that'll emerge from what I want to say. And it's not that you've got all of them or none, that various cults manifest in various different ways. The evidence, again, I'll show you a lot of different types of evidence, very, very, very varied, as you'll see. But equally, I want to make the point that we have to interpret the evidence that we do have, also bearing in mind that we are talking about a period in a very distant past, and that quite a lot of evidence has not survived. And we have to be sensitive to the gaps as well as to what is there. So without more ado, I'm going to take you through two case studies and then make a very brief wrap up at the end, and we can perhaps use the case studies to trigger whatever in the way of discussion and so forth you guys like at the end. So my first case study concerns one of the absolutely most famous of all medieval saints. I'm just wondering whether, oh, I can switch off that little stupid button. There we go. Which is Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered in front of the altar of his own cathedral in Canterbury on the 29th of December, 1170. And this is a manuscript written very shortly after the event, and it gives us really what's the narrative of what happened. As I'm sure that most of you know, Thomas Becket had risen through royal government. He was a man who was literate, who was adroit with words, and he'd risen through royal government in the service of the English King Henry II. And he'd received a really pretty elite education, even though he came from a fairly humble background himself. He'd served as the head of the secular royal administration as Chancellor, and then he was such a loyal servant to Henry II that Henry decided that he would catapult him into the position of being the head of the English Church as Archbishop of Canterbury. This was a time of considerable renegotiation of the respective roles of the monarchy and of the church, and Becket threw himself into his new role with tremendous zeal and fervour, and the consequence was that he very rapidly got up Henry II's nose and really irritated him by insisting on various ecclesiastical privileges and so forth. And to cut a long story short, there's this very probably apocryphal line attributed to Henry II in which he claimed, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" Anyway, he clearly was a man who could get angry, Henry II. He clearly got angry and said something incautious, with the result that members of the royal household rode out in hot pursuit of Becket, who was in the Archbishop's palace at Canterbury just after Christmas. And in fact, he was at table having dinner, and this is what you see in this very first scene here. And what's going on here is a messenger. Here's the door of his dining room, and a messenger is coming in, a cleric is coming in to say that there are hostile armed men outside. Becket here, you know, with his archiepiscopal mitre and everything on it, goes into the cathedral, won't lock the door there. He's after all now a churchman, a man of prayer, and starts praying in front of the altar with his clergy around him. I don't know quite what's happened there. Sorry about that. Yes, here we go. So there he is. He's in his church. Here's the altar with the cross and the chalice on it. There's his priest, his close assistant, whose name we know, standing beside him holding his cross. And here come the armed men wielding their weapons. The result is that he's killed, he's beheaded right in front of his own altar. There's blood all over the inside of the church. So this is a really, truly shocking thing. And the politics of it play out, and very shortly after, a couple of years afterwards, the Pope goes through the procedure of very officially declaring him a saint. And then this last scene, which is this bit here, this is a picture of his tomb in the cathedral at Canterbury, and here are the pilgrims who come to venerate him after his death, and here they are kneeling down and getting as physically as close as possible to the tomb. So that just introduces you to the story, and I've chosen this one partly because there was a very important exhibition about it in London just last year, but partly because it's an example of a cult of someone who is extremely well historically documented. We know a lot about Becket, We know a lot about the very, very controversial politics from many of the different players. And I should add that his career just happens at the time when there is a really sort of explosion and takeoff in the use of writing, both for royal government and by chroniclers and so forth. And there's a really truly exceptional range of sources. This is another beautiful illustration from slightly later, which shows you in a rather more stylized fashion exactly what was going on. And the important point here is that the priest who's accompanying him, hold him the cross, whose name we know, it was Edward the Grim. He wrote an account of it himself, and we know because he tells us that he was injured in the process of the attack on Becket. He survived, but Becket didn't. So we've got an exceptional range of documentation. We've got lives, written narratives of Becket, some of them by people who knew him very well. John of Salisbury was an absolute contemporary, and as soon as he could, he wrote a life to propagate the notion of Becket was a saint. And I should also say that actually he was very, very controversial in the church as a type of saint. So we've got several lives, an exceptional number of lives. Becket, as I've said, was a highly literate man at the centre of royal government at a time when the use of writing was becoming more and more common. And one of the things we've got is a lot of Becket's own letters, several hundred of them. And they were collected together shortly after his death by the prior of Canterbury Cathedral and in effect published. So we know quite a lot about what Becket did, what he thought, who he talked to in his own words. And because of the very shocking story of his death, people immediately transposed onto him an age-old early Christian narrative of the death of the martyr whose blood is a sacrifice that heals other people. And within days, people had been mopping up the blood off the floor of the church and claiming that it was working miracles. And very soon we have these great big compilations of miracles which were attributed to Becket, either at his tomb or in these little bottles of the water that they'd washed the floor, which had the blood in it, and these phials of Becket water were distributed very, very widely. And we've got a lot of these narratives of people who came to Canterbury, sometimes in search of physical healing, sometimes in search of having injustices and wrongs righted, and of people who saw Becket in dreams and visions, who sorted out the problems in their life. And we've got really a lot of those. We've also got a lot of ecclesiastical rituals of the sort of orders of service for formal events commemorating his life and in particular his death. And this is one manuscript here. You've got the full page of it here on one side of the screen. And what I've given you here is the detail here, because what happened, he was originally buried in the crypt, the lower part of the church, but there was a major fire in the church, which not long after his death, which gave the Cathedral at Canterbury the opportunity to rebuild. And they built a new, very special East End dedicated to Becket. And they moved his body from its original burying place into a very, very elaborate shrine, which was in this new East End. And so this is a picture of the Archbishop of Canterbury in 2020. So 50 years later, after the new building has been completed. And here they are opening up the tomb, and they find his body. Here he is laid out like a corpse. You can see his eyes are closed. He's got his hands crossed across his body, the standard where you lay out a corpse. They take his body out and they put it in a new, very, very elaborate shrine. And they develop new orders a service to celebrate not only his original death, but this feast of his translation. So they add a new day to the church calendar of celebrations where they're specially marking his cult. So we've got all this liturgical evidence as well. And the new shrine that they built, this is quite a complex photograph. It's a photograph of actually the East End of Canterbury Cathedral as it survives to this day. But everything in this space that I'm, running the cursor around is a CAD mock-up. And you'll see in a minute why. So this is what the shrine would have been like, this great big gilded shrine covered in gold and jewels on a high plinth in this new Eastern chapel. And this is the cover that could be raised and lowered over it. It's on chains, and it came up and down. And here we've got an altar in front of it. We've got a priest watching somebody praying at the altar, and then we've got a couple of people. This is all part of the computer graphics and so forth that's been superimposed on this image. So this was built specifically to give a grand architectural setting for Becket's cult. And one of the things that's very striking about it is that this grand architectural setting extended to the windows of this building, and some of the most glorious surviving medieval stained glass is in Canterbury Cathedral. And there are something like a dozen of these huge windows, and all these roundels and these medallions. There's one or two panels which tell details about Becket's life, but most of them, like this one, this large one here, are telling us the miracle stories. So this is a picture book, if you like, in stained glass of Becket's post-mortem activity. And so here you see Becket, long after his death, clothed as the Archbishop with his cross, and he's appearing to a sick man on his bed at home with his wife beside him. And he is telling this sick man through this vision what he needs to do to be healed. In other words, to go to the church, and that he's healed. And so we've got this extraordinary detail of very, very, very high quality stained glass. So that's another medium of representation. A picture book. The challenge of these windows, of course, is that they're very tall. And if you go to Canterbury, you can't actually see the detail. The photographs have been taken when scaffolding has been put up inside the church for recent restoration of them. Quite how they were interpreted to people in the Middle Ages, I don't know. I suspect the priests may have, done a sort of show and tell to explain what was going on. And Becket's tomb, as all of you who've read any of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales know, rapidly developed into a really, really, really major international pilgrimage site that people came to in very large numbers and from very long distances. And this is a late 15th century painting from a church in Germany of Becket's shrine. And the figure who's praying here at the shrine is the French king, Louis VII. So who did indeed come to Canterbury in the 13th century, early 13th century. So this is a German picture of a French king at this English shrine. And you can see here the cripple with his crutches, the crippled child or someone who's here in a sort of carry sling. You can see the very richly dressed courtiers, and you can see the secular people in the background and the contemporary archbishop there playing. So this is just an indication of the extraordinary publicity and appeal that this particular cult had throughout the rest of the Middle Ages. And it had that appeal until the moment when another King Henry VIII, decided to sever the English Church from the International Catholic Church in Rome and launch the English Reformation. And the cult of Becket became a lightning rod, if you like, for everything that Henry VIII didn't like about the Catholic Church and its international organization. And so that's what remains now in Canterbury Cathedral. That is now how it looks. That's the view from the other end, looking westwards rather than eastwards, from where Becket's shrine was. It was completely demolished. There are lots of books in which we know that Becket's name was scored out, that whole pages were ripped out, the liturgical services were cancelled in one way or another. I've seen pages where they're overpainted so that you can't read the text or anything. But Henry VIII's henchmen did everything that they possibly could, to stop Becket's cult and to just eradicate Becket. And the result is that for all this medieval grandeur and all these books, there's actually very, very little of Becket left. And what we've got here, this is the only surviving piece of that very grand shrine that I showed you the mock-up of, and that's why it was a computer-aided graphic mock-up. That's the only piece of it that has survived, and we think that's from the shrine, a piece of very wonderful red marble, a little capital. And this is the only piece of Becket's body, or what is probably Becket's body, that survives, a tiny, tiny piece of his skull. And it only survives because some pious Catholic rescued it when the shrine was being destroyed in Henry VIII's reign, and it was taken to the continent, and it survived in a church in Belgium. So that is, other than the manuscripts, which are very dispersed in libraries, mostly in England, but some of them on the continent, that is all of this very, very famous cult which survives. So we've got this paradox in the case of Becket, that we know a lot about his life, we know a lot about the details of his death, all very historical. We know a huge amount about the cult site. We know a lot about the political context. We can be very, very precise about what caused his death, the controversies he got to, how the cult developed, why it was so popular, and then why it was demolished. And there, as you've seen, there are so many different media. We've got stained glass, we've got buildings, we've got manuscripts, we've got letters, we've got all sorts of, and I could have gone on and on and on, but that's enough. So that's one example of truly a historical person of whose historical existence and activities there is absolutely no doubt. We know a huge amount about them, very, very well documented, one of the most famous of all cults, and it's been snuffed out, and that's what's left. So what I want to do now in the second half, the last few slides, is to contrast that with another very, very, very different cult, and hope that you can get some sense of the variety. And this is a cult which started on the continent, and it's a legendary cult. We've got no contemporary evidence. The legend is that a troop of Roman soldiers were marching north from Italy across the Alps into Gaul in around the year 290 in the reign of the Emperor Diocletian. That this Roman legion, which came from Thebes in Egypt, had among its leaders many Christians, which is perfectly possible, that they were met by the ferociously pagan Emperor Diocletian's troops, and that they were massacred at the point where the very narrow high mountain pass of the Alps that takes you on the road from Italy into Gaul just comes out over the Alps and drops down into the much, much flatter land. Sorry, I keep doing that, around Lake Geneva. And this is Lake Geneva here. And so this is a view as if you've got the high Alps behind you and you're just coming down out of the mountains, as the legend was imagined in 1750. And this Theban legend, they're developed from probably from the late 4th century onwards, a shrine dedicated to these people at exactly the point where the very narrow mountain pass becomes much wider, and it became a very major pilgrimage site, and it's now a very, very interesting archaeological site. And this Theban legion was led by a general called Maurice, and St. Maurice became a very popular saints cult in his own right. And this is the cult of St. Maurice today. His remains are in that late 12th, early 13th century shrine. This is the priests of his church with the, sorry, it's too sensitive, with the Swiss guards from the papal entourage, because this monastery is in Switzerland, on their annual feast day, processing the saint. He's their patron saint, and they're processing him through their town. And this does take place exactly like this, once a year still. But the point about Maurice was that he was the commander of a whole legion. So there's a whole legion full of these dead soldiers. And the cult that I'm particularly interested in, we first hear about 150 or so years later, when the Bishop of Lyon, called Eucherius, writes an account of the death of the martyrdom of this whole legion. We have no idea how historical it may or may not be. There is strong grounds for thinking that it's a way of giving a Christian identity to a very vigorous pagan cult site. So did any of these people ever live? We have no idea. The only thing we do know is that there was a large Roman cemetery. In other words, there were lots of bodies. That's the only thing we know. And when Eucherius wrote this account, this passion, the account of the death of the martyrs, and the site itself was called Agon, he named some of the senior officers in Maurice's retinue. And the one who interests me in particular is Maurice's lieutenant, his second in command, whose name was Candidus. And this is Candidus. Or at least this is Candidus as he was imagined in the late 12th century in a reliquary bust. And what you've got here is you've got a panel depicting, you can see his head being chopped off by the soldiers. His soul is here being carried up to heaven by the angels. And this very, very striking bust portrait standing on this plinth. And the whole thing is, it's a good 2 foot, 30 inches tall. It probably was made about 1175, 1180. So there's no independent saints cult of Candidus except for this. He exists as Maurice's sidekick. So he acquires his own career centuries after Maurice's cult develops. And then he's brought into the limelight when this is made. And the reason why this interests me so much is that in 1962, the Swiss art historians decided to see what was inside this. And what I now want to do is show you a series of black and white photographs which show you what's inside this. And the first thing that's important to note is that it's got a wooden core, and then the silver, gilt and jewels have been overlaid around that. And you can see here, there's the profile of it, that it's hollow. It's got a great big space inside that was filled with stuff. And the other thing that's important to note is that right up here at the top, there's a gap. You can't see it on this photograph, but you'll see later there was a little gap and there was a little access door in the top. And the other thing is that this whole bit, the whole crown of the head, lifts off. So you could put things in here, then you put the top on it. You quite literally can, you'll see in a minute, you could lift the top off and then you put the top on and you close the little door and there was lots of stuff inside it. So this is what they discovered, and it was cracked, as you can see here. This is a detail of the crack that runs down through the poor guy's right ear. And it was full of stuff. And the first thing when they took, you can see here where they've taken that, the crown, the top of it off. This is the original 12th century cut. And you can see here where that little square opening in it. The first thing they discovered was a large piece of human skull. And you can see here there's a bit of paper, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And there's that skull. It's the cranium, it's the top bone of the head. And there's, you can see where it's blackened, that's the bit that was visible. And that's where people who came to venerate the saint would come and rub it and touch it and kiss it and so forth. And then tucked neatly underneath this, sort of fitting under the bowl of this piece of skull, they found a piece of paper, which is written, we know, in 1659, which tells us that here's Candidus's head. 13 notable pieces of his body, 7 teeth, and 20 fragments of his bones. And here it is, all is, and then various other bits and bobs they found in there. Is it Candidus? Whose was it? We've got absolutely no idea. All that matters is that the people who put it in there believed that this was Candidus. So it tells us that what's inside matches what's outside. At least that's what they thought in 1659. And in there also, with the piece of paper, they found a whole load of other stuff. So this is the top coming off. They found all these bundles of things and cloth. And there you are looking into, they've now turned, this photograph shows you the piece of cranium, the skull, turned upside down, all these things very, very carefully wedged underneath it. And one of the things that came out, you can see here this little row in the black and white photograph of zigzags, when it was taken to the textile conservation lab, turned out to be this very beautiful skull cap with a little gold band, which is almost like a coronet running around it. And this is a life-size replica that the textile conservation people made. And the woman who runs the lab told me very sweetly that after they made this absolutely perfect replica of it, all her staff spent several days going around wearing it, and it fits perfectly. So anyway, very, very curious thing. Why would you put this cap inside a reliquary? We don't know, but that's the first thing that came out once they'd taken out the piece of the skull. And then all these bundles, bits of cloth, little parchment labels, and all these little tiny, tiny bundles. And these are still the 1962 photographs. This is what medieval relics look like. This is how they were found, all bundled up in these larger bits of cloth. And it turned out that the reliquary had been taken apart, as I've said, in 1659 and investigated, and then everything had been put back in it, and it had been completely resealed until 1962. So in effect, its contents are a time capsule, and people were very, very surprised about what they found inside it. So this is by the time they've taken most things out, and this is just looking right down the shaft. So this is looking into the neck. This is all the various odds and ends which have been wedged in 1659 down into the bottom, fragments of leaf, little bits of metal, plate, there's a pilgrim token, little gemstones, and of course lots and lots and lots of dust. But anyway, so that's what was inside it in 1962. And when you take all those things and work out what they were, the little bundles were taken apart, the labels were sent to the archives, and the cloth wrappers of the bundles were taken to a textile centre for conservation, and then they came back to the monastery, and they're in a display in a different part of the monastery from the labels. The bits of bone were put back inside that silver reliquary head, so I can't show you them in their modern state. But this map, which took me a long time to put together a few years ago, there's the place where this comes from, Saint-Maurice d'Agone. When we think about who the saints are, whose relics were inside, they come from where all these red spots are all over. So it's an extraordinary map of contacts. And then they're wrapped in textiles, some of which come from these places in the Eastern Mediterranean, but some of which come from as far away as Asia and China. And all this stuff was found inside this reliquary in 1962. Some of it was lost and only came to light again in about 2013. Some of it they already knew, but we can now see pretty much what was inside it, as I say, with the exception of the bones. And I was privileged enough to be invited to work on those little tiny parchment labels which tell you who the saints were. And I worked alongside the Swiss colleague who worked on the textiles, identifying the textiles and where they came from. So what I want to do to end is show you what a couple of saints look like in this context. And this is a saint called Justus, who was the Bishop of Lyon in the 5th century, who resigned his see and went to Egypt and died in Egypt, and his body was brought back from Egypt. And this is one of the few saints where you can put everything together, and the relic itself was this bit of rather unusual silk with a pattern that's woven in 2 different colours of beige, and there's the label that tells you that this is a relic of St. Justus. And all of that was wrapped up in this piece of absolutely gorgeous silk with these peacock eye designs on it, which is probably an offcut from a very splendid Byzantine court ceremonial tunic. So bits of old fabric that have been reused. This is what represented the saint, is this piece of very, very interesting old silk, quite possibly that had come back from Egypt when they took his body back to Gaul. And so in this case, we can put the parchment label and the textile wrapper and the contents of the wrapper all together. And for the most part, we can't do that because a lot of the string tying them together had degraded and because of the disturbance from 1659. But the one that interests me most is this one. And St. Euphemia was a very, very famous martyr who was killed in what's now Western Turkey around 300, 305. May well have been a historical figure, but she was the person whose name came to represent the correct Orthodox teaching of the Church in the late Roman period. And her cult was very, very widespread. And what's fascinating about this is 2 things, is that the relic itself was absolutely tiny. It's this little piece of rose pink silk, and you can see the scale here. That scale, it's metric, that's 1 centimetre. So this thing is just a few millimetres big. And it was labelled with this, which is a massive, massive papyrus label. Very, very unusual. This is the only saint's label in papyrus for anywhere north of the Alps, written very gloriously in a late 7th century handwriting. With practice, you can read it, but it's difficult. And I think you can even see on this photograph that it's papyrus made out of Egyptian reed. That's, you know, the reeds are squashed and laid crosswise with each other, completely different from all the other labels which are in parchment. And altogether, it was wrapped in this piece of pretty rough linen, undyed, unpatterned cloth, which we can't really date. So that's what these people thought in the 7th century was this martyr from about 300 plus minus from Asia Minor. So that's a completely different sense of what a saint is, what a saint's presence is. And it's taken quite a lot of work to put these together because these textiles are kept in one part of the monastery and all these labels are kept in another part of the library. So the only way I can reassemble these relic bundles is actually by putting images, slides together like this. So this really is the point at which I want to end. by making the point that in talking about saints' cults, we're talking about fragments. We're talking about incomplete evidence. There's a fragment, there's Euphemia. That's all that remains of Thomas Becket, the most historical of the saints I've been talking about. And there's St. Maurice, who may or may not ever have existed, being processed round a Swiss town in the 21st century. So there's a huge variety of saints' cults. They're very varied. The evidence is very varied, and it's also often very patchy. And from my own point of view, the challenge and the fun is working across all these different types of evidence, the material, quite literally fabric, textile, the physical, the architectural, the textual, the spatial, and trying to make sense of it in terms which respect the dignity and the cultural integrity of people in the Middle Ages. And I think that's probably the point at which I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we can return to whatever else it may be that we're going to be doing and talking about.
Fantastic. So, thank you very much, Professor Smith.
So over to you guys now.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the talk, Professor Smith. That was really fascinating stuff, I think, especially gaining an appreciation for, as you said, the variety of different sources, the variety of different relics, the variety of different cults that one is able to work with. I'd like to start with a question about the relics themselves, if that's all right. And I'd like to ask, what do you think was the impact for believers of having this tangible bit of a saint that they were perhaps able to touch or to rub or to bless or even to bow down to? What do you think perhaps, differentiated that from the experience of perhaps, professing their faith without these kind of tangible touch points of a particular saint or holy person?
I think you've said something very important there, Joao. What's important is touch. And touch is a very primordial sense of directness of contact. And one colleague pointed out to me some years ago that our first experience of the world as infants and coming into the world is touch. It's the touch of mother, midwife being held. It's the only sense that you never lose. You can go blind, you can lose your taste, you can lose your smell, you can lose your hearing. You can never lose your sense of touch. And if you've ever sat by the bed of a dying person, you know that touch is the last way that you can communicate with someone in their death. So there's something very, very primordial. You don't need words if you can touch. And I think it's both as simple and as deep as that, is that it's a very instinctive form of behavior. You see it over and over again in a very wide range of different religious contexts, is the immediacy of touch as a medium of communication.
I see. That's really fascinating.
And it's very hard to put into words as a historian.
I can imagine. So I think it's a very visceral thing, isn't it? It's almost,
yes.
Hearing about the stories of a saint and then actually being able, as you say, to have that really sort of intimate, visceral connection with a holy person by, to touch something that was part of their lives. And I expect that, for believers at the time, that must have been such a profoundly powerful thing to be so close to a saint and things like that.
That certainly emerges from all the stories around Becket, and the way that what was accessible was the blood that was spilt and how it was mopped up and kept. And also you saw it in some of those manuscript illustrations where you can see pilgrims going up to the tomb, and when they'd elevated him into his high tomb in 1220, there was a big space underneath that you could get underneath. You could be physically almost enveloped by the shrine. So this sense of proximity, of touch in whatever way you can. It's one of the reasons, of course, why churches were so keen to find ways of protecting and guarding these objects, was that they didn't want everyone to touch them and take them away. And there are endless stories of how people, the extremes that people went to get hold of bits. There's a lovely story of a 12th century quite famous Bishop of Lincoln, who went to venerate a saint, I can't remember offhand which one, and went to kiss the body of this saint, and in the process bit off a bit of his finger so that he could take it home.
Good Lord.
So yes, people go to all sorts of lengths to acquire and to own. And the other thing is touch is obviously important. And if you can own it so that it's yours and you've got it immediately and you don't have to go to a church or anything, then that's also very important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another thing I think that really struck me was the power of writing.
Yes.
And the way that that became a really interesting medium, I think, especially as the High Middle Ages came in and that started to become particularly important. What specific effects do you think that actually had on being able to propagate the cult of a saint? And how do you think that compared to perhaps early medieval cults that perhaps obviously did have writing in some capacity, but perhaps in not quite as widespread a way?
Well, I think it has several consequences. One is in terms, and Beckett's cult shows this geographical reach. Another is that a cult can take a form at a geographical distance which is closer to that which it is at the original cult site if people have got the same stories. So writing can actually shrink distance. It can make it very popular in all sorts of ways. And again, thinking with Beckett, on the one hand, there are all those wonderful liturgical books which, spread the formal ecclesiastical services. But then you've also got something like the Canterbury Tales. And the Canterbury Tales, of course, it's a highly wrought literary text, but it's a text about storytelling. And the two, the written and the oral, they interact with each other all the time. And, who knows what pilgrims told each other when they went to Canterbury. They were probably talking about how muddy the roads were and how filthy the weather and where they were going to get their next meal from and things like that. And Chaucer jazzed it all up. But it's this interplay of oral and written. So the two are always in a very fruitful and interesting dialogue with each other. And they still are today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I can imagine that particularly if there are individuals who are further away, who perhaps, heard it via, a mixture of perhaps written texts and oral accounts and things like that. I imagine the capacity to bring a sense of presence and awe to a particular saint must have been enormous.
That's exactly what some of the Beckett stories do. When people hear the stories, and then there are these reports that Beckett appears in dreams, says, no, you don't actually have to go all the way to Canterbury, I can heal you here or whatever. So it's there's an immediacy about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's really fascinating. I suppose another thing which I think could be quite interesting to discuss is perhaps the gender of saints. Now I'd be interested, I suppose, we talked predominantly about sort of different male saints, but were female saints at all different in the way that they portrayed, or was it again just a case of being very sort of ad hoc, very much kind of as the cult rose as it did, or were there certain patterns between different genders and how they were portrayed with regards to sainthood?
Well, yes, there are. And the first thing to say is that statistically speaking, the large majority of saints are men. But it has been graphed out over the 1,000+ years of the Middle Ages that there is a rising proportion of female saints. And that's to do with something that I didn't talk about, which is the emergence of more ways of qualifying, of becoming a saint than having your head chopped off and meeting violent death. And the notion that you get from the early 4th century onwards that various forms of pious and particularly ascetic life can be regarded as a lifetime equivalent, as living martyrdom, if you like. And so slowly and gradually, yes, you get more female saints, and particularly from the 13th, 14th, 15th century onwards. But they remain, statistically speaking, a minority. And beyond that, of course, you've got to think, well, the Middle Ages is a role of pretty, constrained gender roles, you're not going to be a woman and a bishop, and therefore all Episcopal saints are men. There are a very, very few royal female saints, but quite a lot of kings become saint, either because they die in battle or for their piety, but far fewer queens. They don't have as much opportunity in their lived life to, attract attention. They have less agency in their own life. There are quite a lot of female saints who were abbesses, who ran monastic communities, and by the later Middle Ages there are quite a lot who were mystics and visionaries and hermits and things like that. You're not going to get the sort of saint who is, killed leading troops into battle. It's a very, very stark example of the way that there is a sharp gender differentiation. The really interesting questions come when you start asking about saints, female saints, in terms of whether they're, to use the church's language, virgins, or married or widowed. And the majority of female saints are either ones who have led an ascetic, chaste life, or they're ones whose pious and ascetic life comes in their widowhood. It's quite interesting, but not very common at all, to find women who are behaving in ways while they're married. And it's usually how they get out of marriage and the things they do afterwards. There's a very famous 13th century German saint, Elizabeth of Thuringia, who's widowed at 24. And when her husband dies, she inherits all his wealth, but she thinks, great, I can give it all away and start, doing charitable good works and things with it. And so the marriage for her was the route to have the resources to lead the sort of pious life she wanted to do. She was canonized as a saint. And then there was a very small cult of her husband later on, but only because he was her sidekick. So there are very, very, very clear gender differences, yes.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting. I think especially because certainly in the High Middle Ages, it's the time when the cult of the Virgin Mary starts to become really prominent. Yes. She becomes an enormously important saint, perhaps, the most so. And yet we still have this, I think, real marginalization of female sainthood. And would I be right in thinking that this was perhaps something that was more prominent perhaps in the High Middle Ages than it was in the early Middle Ages? Or was it more of just a consistent thing throughout?
Well, I think you're right. I think the cult of the Virgin Mary, it does seem to intensify. And of course, there's much less evidence from the early Middle Ages. It's a cult which is much better developed in the Byzantine East from about the 5th, 6th century onwards. And some of those Byzantine ideas, they find expression in Rome from the late 7th century onwards, and then they spread into the Carolingian world from the 9th century onwards. So there is a sort of slower and gradual takeoff in the West, and then this real 12th century explosion in the West of multiple forms of localizing Mary so that she's a local saint wherever she is, despite being everywhere. So there's an internal contradiction there, which is part of the fascination of the cult. She's a virgin, she's a mother, etc., etc., etc. She's a figure that holds a lot of tensions and contradictions together, which gives it great appeal and great flexibility. But the other thing to say about that is one of the things that we know about the exercise of royal power in medieval courts, for example, and actually Henry II with his famous irascible temper is a good example, is a queen as a figure who can say, hey, stop, you've overstepped the bounds, you've got to be generous, in effect you've got to be merciful. And this role of the queen, who we know historically, not all queens, but some queens, would be effective intercessors who could put a block on the royal anger and constrain it for the advantage of other people. And that's very much what, in terms of Christian thinking, the role of Mary is, who intercedes to protect and to help people at the court of the all-powerful in heaven. So in that sense, there's an echoing, if you like, of gender roles between the cult and what we know about the way that secular royal power really did work.
Absolutely. And I think we can definitely see that depicted in the way that Mary is almost seen as the queen intercessing at the throne of God.
She's seen in all sorts of ways. She's seen as intercessor, she's seen as mother. There's a lovely book, which if you haven't read it, I recommend, by Amy Remsnyder, called La Conquistadora, on Mary as the figure who leads the Spanish troops and the conquest of the Spanish Americas. And of this infinitely flexible figure. And that's another interesting play on the gender roles, that she's taken, the cult has taken from the Reconquista in Spain across the Atlantic into the New World and acquires this very different form there.
That's really fascinating. And I suppose going on a slight tangent from that, but I think something that we perhaps touched on a little bit, I appreciate there was probably some interplay between perhaps, the high church and perhaps just sort of local cults in sort of forming the image and traits of a saint. How did that often play out in practice? I imagine it was probably very different depending on the particular saint, but...
Well, yes, it did. And that's one of the ways in which it makes it really impossible to generalize. And it's always the case that despite the church's efforts to seize control of the saint-making process from the early 13th century onwards, that they actually never succeeded in the Middle Ages. And there are all sorts of fascinating cults which flicker up and disappear again. I mean, for example, a very famous 13th century English rebel who was killed in back in 1265, Simon de Montfort. There's an effort to establish a cult of him. There are all sorts of local initiatives there, and that's true everywhere. And again, the paradox is that if you're going to, apply, from the 13th century onwards for formal canonization in Rome, you actually have to produce the evidence that this person's already doing saintly things and working miracles, and that still is the case. So it is always local activity and political initiative, it's politics, and politics is about power. It's about whose ear you've got, and of course, it's always about money. Was and is.
Absolutely. Absolutely, as is often the case. I mean,
Yes.
throughout history and even through to today.
Yeah.
Excellent. And I suppose one final question from me would be, where would you like to see where would you like to see this particular discipline moving and evolving in the coming years? What niches do you think still need to be explored?
I think that there is much more scope for comparative multicultural work on cults, and some of it is to think in a much more careful way about the similarities and differences between the Christian world, the cults you get, the relic cults in Buddhism, Sufi cults in Islam, and so forth. I think there's a huge amount of scope for that. I think one of the other things is there would be a lot of opportunity, and again, people have done some of this, but not in any very, as far as I know, not in any very intellectually rigorous way, is to think about what maintains this sort of energy flowing between a dead person and living people with respect to people in our own age. Notoriously or famously, one might say, when Princess Diana died in a car accident, there were very, very, very immediately medievally recognizable patterns of behavior. What is it that drives people? So I think there's a role for thinking about from a psychological perspective, as well as from a sort of formal ritual perspective and a representational perspective that would benefit from a lot more work.
I see what you mean. I think both would be really fascinating fields.
So I mean, I mean, I don't myself have the skills to do that sort of thing. You know, I've got skills to do other things, but I think there are all sorts of really imaginative and interesting things that can be done.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, if anybody's watching, thinking about PhD ideas and places to go, I think both of those would be very worthwhile fields to explore and look into. Fantastic. Yeah. I'm afraid to say that comes to the end of our discussion tonight. And more of pity, I think there's so many more different tangents and areas that we could discuss. But nevertheless, I would like to thank Professor Smith for her time. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Ra, and to everyone else who is out there, whoever you may be. And I hope it, gives you some thoughts and suggestions for ways of taking your own work forward.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
In the next episode. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.